Here is a strange, small fact, and tonight we are going to take our time with it. There was once a carpenter in a village so small it barely troubled the map, whose house and workshop stood under a single roof. And one quiet Sunday, the two of them burned together down to the ground. So he built again, grander this time, a proper house, with 2 stone lions standing guard at the door, and behind it, a new workshop, larger than the one the fire had taken. That house has never burned, not once in all the years since. It is standing still, in fact, this very evening, exactly where he built it. But the business behind it was not finished with fire yet. It burned a second time, years later, in the cold of a war that had nothing to do with Billund at all. And it burned a third time after that, in a warehouse full of wooden toys, on a night the whole village came out to watch. 3 fires, all told, across 4 decades of one family's work. Not the same building, each time, a home, once, a workshop grown into a factory, once, a warehouse, once, but the same family, standing in the ash, deciding every time what came next. 3 fires, 1 family, a single street of a village, out on the Heath, where the wind never quite stops moving, and the winters arrive early and stay long past their welcome. You would forgive them for giving up wood altogether, for deciding that timber and this village, and perhaps the whole trade of building things by hand, simply did not want them. After the first fire, they rebuilt. After the second, they rebuilt again, a little larger, a little sounder each time. After the third, they chose differently. They let the wooden toys go for good and staked what was left of everything on a small plastic bricks instead. Somewhere in all that, starting over, quietly, without any fanfare at all, had already come a much smaller decision too. To start making toys, alongside the furniture and the coffins and the doors, in a country sliding into hard times. Nobody thought at the time that this small decision would matter half as much as it eventually did. 3 fires, and out of the last of them came a company that would eventually put a small plastic brick into nearly every home on the planet. We are speaking, of course, of Billund, of a carpenter named Old Kirk, and of the company that would one day be called Lego. Tonight is not about the bricks, not yet. Tonight is about the fires that came first, and the family that kept rebuilding, right up until the one time they chose not to. This is the house that burned 3 times. Only tonight, let house mean what this family always meant by it, not just 4 walls and a roof, but the whole of what they built together and lost together and built again. And tonight his story, told slowly and quietly, for as long as you can stay awake. Before we begin properly, let's settle. Wherever you are, lying right now, let your shoulders soften into the mattress. Let your jaw unclench. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing else you need to do. Close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and breathe deeply. In, slowly, and out. More slowly still. Again, in, and out. Let each breath fall a little further than the last, like a stone settling to the bottom of a still pond. If you would like to leave a comment before you drift off, I would love that. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there, wherever that may be. I'll read everyone in the morning with a cup of something warm, before the day properly starts. There is something rather lovely about hearing from a dozen different time zones at once. All of you drifting off together in the dark on opposite sides of the earth. And if this kind of story helps you rest, consider subscribing, but only if it genuinely helps you rest. There is no pressure here. This is a quiet corner of the internet, and it would like to stay that way. One more small promise, and then we'll begin. Any adverts will only ever come before the story begins. We never interrupt the story once it has started. It's how we keep the fire lit, all the way till morning, without a single draft getting in. Tonight, the story of a carpenter on a Danish heath, and the small plastic brick his family's business would one day become known for, though that part is still a long way off yet. You don't need to follow every date, every name, every small turn of fortune. Let it drift past you, the way smoke drifts past a window. There if you look, gone if you don't. Somewhere out on the flat farmland of central Jutland, a boy is standing in a workshop doorway, watching wood shavings curl off his brother's plane and fall soft as feathers to the floor. You are standing on the heath in the part of Denmark where the land simply stops trying. No hills to speak of, no forest worth mentioning, just heather and wind and a long grey sky that seems to go on well past the edge of what you can see. Farmers out here will tell you the soil is thin and stubborn, and that anything that grows on it has to want to. This is where Ole Kirk was born, in a small farming parish called Filskov, in the spring of 1891. He was one of 13 children. 13. Picture that house for a moment. The noise of it, the crowded warmth of it, everyone finding their own small corner. Someone always mending something, someone always waiting for the pot to be passed along. He would say later in life that they grew up modest but happy, trusting, as he put it, in the mercy of God, because there was rarely very much else to trust in, out on land like this. From the age of 7 he was out herding cattle for the neighbouring farms, earning a few coins to bring home, learning early the particular patience of standing very still in wide open weather, watching animals that were in no hurry at all. There was no question of an idle childhood out here. The heath did not really allow for one. Whatever a boy might have dreamed about on those long grey mornings with the cattle, he kept mostly to himself. But there was, in him, a quiet steadiness that people noticed even then. Grown men would remark on it, the way he finished what he started, the way he did not complain about cold hands or long hours. And so, when the time came, he was sent to learn a proper trade from his older brother, a joiner and carpenter, working a little further along the road, in a village called Give. It was ordinary, unremarkable work to begin with. Learning to read the grain of a plank before you cut it. Learning to set a joint so tight it needed no nail at all. Learning to plane a door until it swung shut on its hinges, without the smallest complaint. Small, patient skills, each one built quietly on top of the last. He earned his journeyman's papers in his early 20s, which meant by the custom of the time that he was now free to travel and take work wherever a carpenter was needed, the way tradesmen had done for generations before him. It was less a career decision than an obligation, a kind of coming of age built into the trade itself. You learned, you were tested, then you went out into the world to prove it, before anyone let you settle down again. So he travelled. Military service came first, as it did for every young man of his generation. A season spent standing to attention in a Copenhagen barracks that must have felt like another planet after the heath. Then came work further south, in the border country, and further still, a whole cold winter in Norway, in a wood products factory beside a river, learning new machines, new methods, a slightly different way of doing the same steady work. He would have written home rarely, if at all. There would have been little to say beyond. The work is hard, the winter is long, and I am well. He was, by every account, simply doing what young tradesmen of his generation did, learning, saving a little, drifting further from the heath before eventually, inevitably, drifting back to it, the way a stone thrown outward from a pond always sends its ripple home again. He came home in the middle of the Great War, with a little money carefully saved, and a plan that was really no plan at all beyond this, to have a workshop of his own, however small, however far from anywhere else. The village he chose was called Billund. If you had stood in the middle of it in those years, you could have seen the whole of it without turning your head very far. A handful of farms and small holdings, a grocery shop, a dairy, a blacksmith, an inn, a small mission hall, a school, a cooperative store. and one joinery already standing, all ready for sale, its previous owner ready to move on to something else. That was the entirety of Billund. A crossroads with a few dozen roofs on it, out on the Heath, easily missed if you were passing through in a hurry. Though almost no one in those days had any reason to pass through Billund at all. He bought it. The story goes that it cost him 10,000 kroner, very nearly everything he had saved through all those years of travelling, for a modest woodworking and carpentry business with a house attached above and beside it. He was still only in his mid-20s. That same year, he married a young woman named Christine Sørensen, the daughter of a local cheesemaker, and the two of them settled into the rooms above the workshop, as though the whole of their future might simply unfold there, quietly, one plank at a time, one Sunday at a time, one child at a time. And for a while, it did. The workshop made what a village like Billund actually needed, and nothing more grand than that. Doors and window frames and kitchen cupboards, chests of drawers, tools for cutting peat from the bog, since peat was still how half of rural Denmark kept itself warm through the long winters. Coffins too, when they were needed, which out here, eventually they always were. And beyond the village itself, larger commissions arrived, one by one, as word travelled the way word does in small places. A farm building here, a dairy there, a mission hall, even a country church, its pews and doors and roof beams all shaped first in Olkirk's own workshop before being carried out, piece by piece, to wherever they were needed. He hired men. He trained apprentices, the way he himself had once been trained. Slowly, patiently, without any great drama to it, the business grew into something a family could actually live on. And then, a little later, into something rather more than that. Now, here is where the first fire comes in. It was a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1924. Ole Kirk and Christine were resting, as families did on a Sunday in the rooms above the shop, the whole village gone quiet in that particular way a Danish Sunday goes quiet. Their sons Carl Georg, 5 years old, and Gottfried, 4, had wandered down into the workshop to play, the way children always find their way toward exactly the place they have been told more than once to stay well away from. There was a glue heater down there, the kind used to warm animal hide glue until it turned liquid enough to spread across a joint. The boys, the story goes, were trying to light it themselves, the way they had no doubt watched the men do 100 times without ever once being asked to help. A stray flame met a pile of wood shavings, dry as paper, swept into a heap against the workshop floor, exactly where it always was on a Sunday, waiting to be cleared away on Monday morning. It went up fast, wood shavings do. By the time anyone upstairs understood what was happening, the workshop below was already lost, and the flames had begun climbing toward the house itself. Everyone got out. Nobody was hurt. And that, more than anything else in this whole story, is the detail worth sitting with for a moment, before we move past it. A carpenter's entire working life, and the roof over his family's heads gone within a single afternoon. And yet everyone he loved walked out of it, together, and stood in the yard, watching it burn, and none of them so much as singed. You can imagine the quiet of that evening, the smell of it still hanging in the air long after the flames themselves had died down. Small boys standing beside their parents in borrowed coats, looking at a black smoking shell of a building where breakfast had been eaten that very same morning, where their father's tools had hung on their hooks along the wall only hours before. Whatever was said between Ole Kirk and Christine that night, standing in the ruin of everything they had built together, nobody wrote it down. We are left only with what happened next. Most men, having lost almost everything, might have rebuilt modestly. Something smaller, something safer, something that drew as little attention as possible, in case the world decided to take a second swing at it. Ole Kirk did not. He brought in an architect, and he built a house. A proper house, tall and handsome, quite unlike anything else on that single street, with 2 stone lions set to either side of the front door, as though daring the weather or the fates, or whatever unseen force had taken the first house, to try that again. It would come to be known, locally, simply as the Lion House, and it is still standing in Billund today, long after everyone who built it, and everyone who watched it being built, has gone from this world entirely. It was, by most sensible measures, considerably more house than a carpenter in a Heath village could reasonably afford. Which turned out to be true. Old Kirk and his family ended up living in only a portion of it themselves, letting out the rest of the rooms to lodgers, just to keep the finer parts of the roof over everyone's head. There is something rather touching in that, if you sit with it long enough. A man building grandly, out of some private determination not to be diminished by a single afternoon's fire, and then quietly making do with less of the house than he had built, so that the appearance of recovery could, in its own modest way, become the reality of it. Behind the new house stood a new workshop too, larger and better equipped than before, and for a few years business went on much as it always had. Cupboards, doors, farm buildings, the steady, patient rhythm of a village carpenter's life, resuming itself the way a river resumes its course around a fallen tree. Officially, this is a story that only ever counts 3 fires, and we will keep to that counting for the rest of the telling. But some in the family, pressed gently on the matter, will mention a smaller one too. The following year, a scorched corner of the new workshop, caught early, put out before it became anything worse than a fright and a few ruined boards. We mention it once, here, and let it go. The 3 fires everyone remembers will carry the rest of this story well enough on their own. Then the ground shifted again, this time not by fire, but by something slower, and in its own quiet way, just as merciless. The depression that swept the wider world in the years around 1930 found its way, eventually, even to a Heath village in central Jutland, arriving not as a single dramatic event, but as a long grey erosion. Farm prices collapsed. Neighbours who had always paid, eventually, for a new door or a mended cart, now simply couldn't. Old Kirk's order book, which had grown steadily for well over a decade, began to thin, month by month, the way a woodpile thins over a long winter, without anyone quite noticing until the stack is nearly gone. He did what any careful tradesman does when the larger commissions dry up. He looked for smaller ones, cheaper things a family with almost no spare money might still stretch to buy, if the price was low enough and the thing itself was well made, and it brought a little brightness into a hard year. And into that thinking, quietly, came an idea that must have seemed almost too modest to matter at the time. Toys. Small wooden toys, pull-along animals, little trucks, a duck that waddled and clacked its bill as it was tugged along behind a child across a farmhouse floor, yo-yos turned on the lathe in spare moments between larger jobs. Not a grand pivot, not a bold reinvention, not yet. Just a sensible carpenter in a hard year, making something small and cheerful and cheap enough that people might actually buy it, when almost nothing else was selling at all. But 1932 brought a second kind of loss, one far harder to rebuild from than any fire. In the autumn of that year, Christine died at 40 years of age, leaving Ola Kirk a widower with 4 sons to raise alone: Johannes, Carl Georg, Gottfried and Gerhard, aged between 6 and 15 between them. All of them already old enough to know the smell of sawdust and fresh varnish, and the men at the benches who had known them since before they could properly walk. Whatever grief looked like in a Danish carpentry workshop in 1932, it was not the kind that came with time set aside for it. There was a business to keep afloat. There were 4 boys who needed feeding and mending and putting to bed. There was a whole village quietly watching to see whether the man in the grand house with the stone lions would hold together or come apart entirely. He held together, quietly and without much fuss, the way he seemed to do most things in his life. And it was in that same difficult year, grief pressing in on one side, hard times pressing in on the other, each of them heavy enough on its own, that the toys, until then a small sideline to the carpentry, began to matter in a way they never quite had before. It would be a few years yet before Old Kirk gave up the furniture, and the coffins, and the doors entirely, and let toys become the only thing this workshop made. But that decision too was already, quietly, on its way. It did not yet have a name. It was simply Old Kirk's business, making wooden ducks and trucks and yo-yos in a Heath village that most of Denmark had never heard of, run by a widower with 4 sons, and a workshop that had already come back once from its own ashes. Outside, most evenings, the wind still moved over the heath the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent to fires and funerals alike. Inside, the lamp burned low over the workbench, long after the boys had been put to bed, and the shavings curled softly onto the floor around his feet, and a carpenter who had rebuilt once already sat turning a small wooden duck over in his hands, in no particular hurry to call it finished. He did not know yet what to call any of this new, small, hopeful thing growing quietly in the shadow of everything he had lost. That would come soon enough in the following few years, with a name so simple it would later seem entirely inevitable. For now, there was only the work, the quiet, patient, late-night work of a man who had learned, the hard way, once already, that a workshop can burn to the ground, and still, somehow, be rebuilt into something sturdier than before. The lamp burns a little longer, the shavings keep falling, and somewhere in the dark of that workshop, waiting quietly for its name, a very small idea is about to grow very large indeed. Picture the workshop on an ordinary afternoon, late in 1935. Sawdust drifting in the low light, drifting so slowly it seems almost to have nowhere it wishes to be. The benches scarred pale where the plane has passed over it 10,000 times. 1,000,000 times. You'd lose count and it does not matter. By now, toys are the only thing this workshop makes. The furniture, the coffins, the doors, all a few years behind it already. And Old Kirk Christiansen stands near the window with a slip of paper in his hand, and there is a small commotion among the men at the far bench. A soft argument, good-natured, about a name. Billund itself was barely a village then. A scatter of low farmhouses, a church, a general store, and this workshop, all of it ringed by heath and scrub pine running flat to the horizon in every direction. A chill off the heath found its way through every gap in the boards, and in the depths of winter the men worked in their coats, breath visible over the benches, hands numb around the plane handles, until the small stove in the corner caught properly. It was not by any measure a place anyone expected greatness from. It was a place where a name mattered enormously, precisely because so little else about the firm yet did. He has told his workers he wants a new name for the little firm. Something with weight to it, something a shopkeeper in Copenhagen might say twice without thinking. Something a child might say once and remember for the rest of their life. He has offered a prize for whoever thinks of it best. A bottle of his own homemade wine, corked and waiting on a shelf in the back room. Its label blank, its worth entirely a matter of who deserves it. The story goes that the men wrote their guesses on scraps of paper and dropped them into a tin. Names about wood, names about Billund, names about the beech trees on the heath outside. And the story goes too that in the quiet after the tin was opened, it was Ole's own entry that was chosen. 2 Danish words pressed together until they lost their space and became one small, unremarkable-looking thing. Leg got. Play well. He shortened it. He clipped the words the way he might clip a corner off a piece of timber that did not sit right. Until what was left was tidy, 4 letters, easy in the mouth. Lego. It would be a few months yet, not until January of the new year, 1936, before the name was written into the firm's own papers and made official. But in the workshop itself, from that afternoon on, everyone had already, quietly, started calling it by its new name. There is something almost embarrassing about a man awarding himself a prize in his own competition, and something rather lovely about it too. No one seems to have minded very much. He took the bottle home, the story holds, and that was that. It would be many years before anyone in Billund noticed the second, quieter joke folded inside the word, that in the old Latin tongue, long dead everywhere but in church services and school primers, the word Lego can mean I gather or I collect. Nobody chose the name for that reason. Nobody could have, but it sat there all the same, waiting, like a good tool left in a drawer for a task not yet invented, waiting for a small plastic brick that did not exist yet, and would not exist for a dozen years more. You could take this as a sign if you were the sort of person who believed in signs. Old Kirk Christiansen probably was not. He was a carpenter, and carpenters trust the grain of the wood before they trust a coincidence. What he did trust, absolutely, without room for argument, was the plaque he kept above his workbench, and the words he said so often his sons could recite them half asleep, the way you might recite them now, drifting, "De beste ikke forgot." Only the best is good enough. Not the best is good enough, mind. A stricter reading than that. Even the best is barely sufficient. There is no ceiling to the standard, only a floor, and the floor keeps rising. It is easy, hearing a line like that, to imagine a stern man, humorless, difficult to work for. By every account that survives him, old Kirk Christiansen was nothing of the sort. Patient with his men, generous when the firm could afford it, and sometimes when it plainly could not. The kind of employer who kept paying wages through winters, when there was barely enough work to justify it. The severity was reserved entirely for the thing in his hands. A duck could be sent back. A man never was. His son Gottfried learned this the hard way, as the story is usually told, and by all accounts he told it on himself, so it has the ring of something that truly happened, whatever the exact evening looked like. Gottfried was young then, still a boy really, though he had been sweeping this same floor and holding this same glue pot since before he was old enough to be paid properly for it. He was given charge of a batch of wooden ducks, good beach ducks, sanded smooth, the kind that rocked gently on curved rails and clacked their little bills together as a child pulled them along by a string. Each duck was meant to receive 3 coats of clear varnish. 3, applied in turn, dried in turn, so the wood would hold its shine through years of small hands and long winters. Gottfried, wanting to please his father with a saving, gave them 2 coats instead of 3. It was, by any ordinary reckoning, a small thing. The ducks looked just as bright. The crate was packed and sent off by rail toward the shop that had ordered them. Old Kirk found out. Nobody now can say quite how. Perhaps Gottfried told him himself, proud of the thrift, before he understood what he had actually done. And his father did not raise his voice, the story goes. He simply told his son to go to the station, find the crate before the train carried it away, and bring every duck back to the workshop. There followed a long night. The whole crate unpacked duck by duck, each one given its missing coat under lamplight. While outside the Heath went properly dark and properly cold, and the rest of Billund slept. It is not remembered whether Gottfried slept at all. What is remembered, what has been passed down and repeated at every anniversary and every retelling since, is the lesson underneath it. That a coat of varnish nobody would ever notice, missing was to his father the entire question. Quality was not something you performed for a buyer. It was something you kept faith with in the dark, on a night nobody else was watching, for a duck that might sit unnoticed on a shelf for a decade. Years later, after his father was gone, Gottfried would have those very words, "Det beste ikke forgot," cut into a plaque of his own, and hung where every worker walking into the offices in Billund would pass beneath it. The lesson had cost him a night without sleep. He decided it was worth passing on at that price. By the middle of the 1930s, the catalogue leaving Billund each season had grown well past ducks alone. There were wooden trains with carriages that coupled and uncoupled by hand, small painted savings banks shaped like pigs and houses, animals on wheels that a child could tow across a nursery floor, building blocks plain and painted both. The ordinary, honest inventory of a firm that had decided, once and for all, what kind of toy maker it meant to be. Each new item passed under the same plaque, met the same standard, survived or did not survive the same unforgiving eye. Old Kirk was said to have pulled failed pieces from a batch himself, on the factory floor, in front of the men who made them, not as punishment, but as instruction. This is the line, and this is what falls beneath it. The wooden toy line kept growing through these years, unhurried, patient, exactly the pace of a small firm in a small town on the flat Jutland Heath. There were the ducks, and there were pull toys shaped like other creatures too. There were little trucks with wheels that actually turned, and a small wooden yo-yo that, the story goes, very nearly saved the firm during one thin season, when a craze for it swept the country before fading, as such crazes do. There was patience in the workshop, and there was also always a kind of holding of breath, because a firm this size in a town this small was never more than one bad harvest, one bad winter, one small mistake with a glue pot away from trouble. Then, in the spring of 1940, the trouble arrived from somewhere else entirely. German soldiers crossed the border into Denmark in a single morning, and by evening the king had told his people not to resist, and the shape of the country's life changed without a single shot fired anywhere near Billund. You might expect this to be the part of the story where the workshop falls quiet, where the lamps go out and the tools are put away. It is not. It is, strangely, one of the gentler chapters, at least for the business, even as it was a hard and watchful chapter for the country around it. Denmark kept a measure of its own governance through the occupation, an uneasy, careful arrangement, and out in Billund, far from the ports and the barracks, the toy firm found itself with an odd, unlooked-for advantage. Germany had, for years before the war, shipped a great many of its own toys into Denmark's shops. Cheap, plentiful, hard for a small Jutland workshop to compete against. Now those shipments simply stopped. Every German workshop and factory turned over instead to the business of war, and Denmark's shopkeepers found themselves with empty shelves and nowhere else nearby to turn. Metal for toys grew scarce. Rubber grew scarce. But wood was the one material a small Jutland firm always had near to hand, cut from its own forests, planed on its own benches. So, while so much else in the country grew tight and rationed and difficult, the workshop in Billund quietly grew, selling everything it made within Denmark's own borders, to shops that had never needed it quite so badly before. More hands were needed at the benches. More orders came in than the firm had ever seen. Billund's men were not sent off to fight. Denmark's arrangement with the occupying power spared the country the worst of that particular grief. At least for now, at least on this stretch of Heath. But there was still the daily weight of occupation felt by degrees across the whole country. Identity papers to carry, and later, as the years wore on and the arrangement soured, curfews to keep after dark. Nobody in Billund was spared the general unease of those years, even if the worst of it, when it came, arrived from elsewhere. Olkirk kept his workshop running through all of it, kept the wages paid, kept the ducks travelling out, by rail to shops that could no longer stock much else. If there was a kind of grace in this stretch of the story, it sat there, small and unglamorous. Work continuing, wages arriving, a firm holding steady, while so much around it did not. It could not last undisturbed, of course. Very little in this story does. On a March night in 1942, long after the workshop had gone dark, and the last of the men had walked home along the frozen road. A short circuit somewhere in the wiring found something dry enough to catch. By the time anyone in Billund noticed the glow against the sky and sent word to the fire brigade in the next town, there was already too much fire to answer with too little water. The brigade came. It made no real difference. By morning, the workshop, the benches, the half-finished ducts, the stock, the tools worn smooth by 20 years of the same hands, all of it was gone. This was the second time fire had taken nearly everything from him, and Ole Kurt Christensen, standing in the ash the next morning with men who depended on him for their wages, is said to have wondered, seriously and out loud, whether this was where the story simply ended. The insurance, when it came, fell well short of covering what had been lost. There would have been no shame, and perhaps some relief, in shutting the doors for good and finding some quieter way to spend the years that remained to him. He did not shut the doors. He is remembered as saying, in one form or another, that Billund needed the work more than he needed the easy way out. That there were men with families on this heath who had nowhere else to turn, and that a debt like that did not vanish just because a building had. So the ash was cleared, and the timber was ordered, and this time, when the new building rose on the same ground, it rose larger and sounder, and built the way a factory ought to be built, rather than the way a workshop had simply grown, extension by extension, over 20 patient years. The new building was larger than anything the firm had owned before, more modern in every visible way, raised all at once, on purpose, for the scale of production a growing order book now demanded, rather than grown piecemeal, extension by extension, the way the old workshop had been. It was, in every visible way, an improvement on what the fire had taken. It was also, though nobody quite said so aloud, a kind of answer to the two fires themselves. A building put up by a man who had now twice watched everything he owned turn to smoke and ash, and who seemed determined that whatever came next would at least go up harder and slower and give a man more time to get everyone out. It is worth sitting with that decision for a moment, here in the dark, the way you might sit with any decision that turned out to matter more than anyone standing in the ash could have possibly known at the time. He was not building toward the brick. He could not have been. The brick did not exist, would not exist for years yet, was nothing but an idle rumor drifting through toy fairs about a strange new material called plastic. He was building, so far as anyone could tell, exactly what he had always built. A better version of the same good, solid wooden thing. And for a while, that is exactly what the new building gave him. Ducks, yo-yos, trucks with wheels that turned. A quality motto on the wall and a name that meant play well, and somewhere underneath it, folded away like a tool nobody yet needed. That other meaning nobody had chosen on purpose. I gather, the rebuilding held. The war, in its own slow way, would end. And somewhere out past the edge of what anyone in that workshop could see, past the ducts, past the varnish, past even the new brick walls still smelling faintly of fresh mortar, a different kind of building was waiting to begin. Not out of wood this time, out of something that had not yet arrived in Billund at all. In June of 1946, in a hall in Copenhagen thick with the smell of machine oil and new paint, a crowd of Danish toy makers stood in a loose half-circle around something none of them had seen work before. A plastic injection molding machine. Squat, heavy, faintly awkward-looking, next to the lathes and saws these men were used to. And yet, when it was switched on, it did something that made the whole room go quiet. Molten material, forced under pressure into a mold, cooling in a matter of moments into a shape as crisp and exact as anything a craftsman could cut by hand, and doing it again, and again, identical every time, faster than any one pair of hands ever could. Ole Kurt Christensen was somewhere in that crowd. He watched the whole demonstration without saying very much, which those who knew him would have recognized as a kind of loud silence, the silence of a man doing arithmetic in his head. The material itself had a name most of the men in that hall were hearing for the first time. Cellulose acetate, a word that sat awkwardly in a Danish carpenter's mouth. Nothing like the plain, familiar words for beech and pine and glue he had used his whole working life. It came in pellets, not planks. Small, hard, colourless things poured from a paper sack into a hopper. Utterly unlike timber in every way a man could see or touch, and yet capable, this machine insisted, of becoming almost anything a mould could be shaped to hold. He placed his order not long after. The machine itself would have to come from the E.H. Windsor firm in London, and it would not arrive on the Heath until the back end of the following year, sometime after the harvest carried the last stretch by rail into a village that had had its own small station for decades already. The price of it, once it finally stood crated in the yard, was a sum that made his own sons go quiet in a rather less thoughtful way than their father had gone quiet in Copenhagen. It was by any honest measure more than half of everything the firm had earned in its most recent working year, spent on a single machine that nobody in Denmark had yet made a single working toy with, for a material half the country still regarded as a cheap trick, a substitute, not a material in its own right. His sons were not shy about saying so. They had grown up trusting, as their father had taught them to trust, the honesty of good timber. One of them told a newspaper around this time that you could make pretty clever little things out of this new stuff, but that wood was simply the stronger material, the truer one, and there was more than a little relief in his voice as he said it. They would have gone back to wood alone, gladly, and left the machine to gather dust in the corner of the new factory. Their father did not agree, and on this, as on the ducks years before, what their father decided was, in the end, what happened. Around this same time, the English supplier presented Kirk and Gottfried with something else entirely, a handful of small sample bricks, said to have come along with a page or two of drawings, a kind of courtesy, a demonstration of what such a machine might one day be made to turn out. They had been designed by an English toy maker named Hilary Fisher Page, whose small firm made a line of what he called self-locking building bricks, studded on top, hollow beneath, meant to be pressed together and pulled apart by small hands without ever needing glue or string or a grown-up's patience. Page had gone to the trouble of protecting the idea with a patent of his own, back in England, but nothing stopped a Danish carpenter on the far side of the sea from turning one over in his palm, feeling the studs under his thumb, and understanding at once exactly what it was for. Hilary Page had spent years trying to persuade British toy buyers that a plastic brick with studs on top might be worth a place beside the wooden bricks and tin soldiers already crowding the shelves, with only modest success. He died in 1957 and never lived to see what became of the idea in Danish hands, though his own firm carried on for years afterward, under his widow and colleagues, eventually sold on to new owners in 1977, its name outliving him by 2 full decades. It would not be until 1981 that Lego itself finally bought up what remained of the brick rights his firm had once held. But long before any of that, a short sea crossing away, the very same principle he had patented and struggled to sell was about to be worked patiently, brick by brick, into something considerably larger than either man could have first imagined. By the autumn of 1949, Kirk's firm was making its own version. He called them automatic binding bricks, and if the name owed a plain debt to what had arrived in that crate 2 years before, the debt was never much hidden. These were not yet the bricks anyone watching this story from the far end of it would recognize. They did not hold together with any real conviction. 2 studded together and left on a shelf might simply drift apart again by morning. The plastic still slightly wrong in its measure, the studs still slightly wrong in their fit. A child building a tower with them needed a steady hand and low expectations. The trade on the whole was not impressed. A Danish trade paper, having sent a man out to look the new factory over for himself, printed its verdict plainly enough for everyone in the business to see. That plastic, whatever novelty it offered for a season, would never truly replace good, honest wooden toys. It was, in its way, exactly the argument his own sons had already made at the family table, now printed and given the appearance of settled fact. Family legend in Billund holds that whole crates came back unsold that first season or two, and that Gottfried kept a private tally of every one of them, the way a man keeps score of something he means to put right. Nobody now can vouch for the exact number, or even the crates themselves. It is the kind of story a family tells about its own hard early years. True in spirit, if not necessarily in every particular. What the firm's own records do show, plainly enough, is that the early bricks sold respectably, if without any great fanfare. Good enough to carry on, not yet good enough to be anyone's best-selling toy. Old Kurt kept going regardless. Slowly the studded bricks improved. The plastic mix grew truer, the molds grew more exact, the seasons passed. In 1953 the awkward working name was dropped altogether, and what remained on the box was simply the name that had waited there all along, the one chosen in a workshop contest the better part of 2 decades before. Lego Merston. Lego bricks. A name is not a system though, and a pile of bricks, however well made, is still only a pile until somebody gives it a shape to grow into. That piece of the story belongs to Gottfried more than to his father, and it is usually traced back to a single short conversation at a toy exhibition in Britain in the summer of 1954. A buyer for a large Copenhagen department shop, a man named Troels Petersen, fell into talk with Gottfried somewhere among the exhibition stands, and said, more or less in passing, that the whole toy trade suffered from the same fault. There was no system in any of it. Every toy stood alone. Nothing a child bought this year was built to fit with what they had bought the year before. Gottfried carried that sentence home with him the way you might carry a splinter you cannot quite work free, turning it over for months afterward, unable to leave it be. Out of it came what the firm would later call its principles of play, a short, careful list setting out what a good toy should be. Affordable enough for an ordinary family, strong enough to survive an ordinary childhood, suited equally to a girl or a boy, simple enough to add to year after year, without ever needing to throw the old pieces away. By 1955, the firm had a set built entirely around that idea, a little township of streets and buildings meant to be added to a piece at a time, birthday by birthday, so that what a child owned only ever grew and never had to be replaced. The town plan itself was a small, careful thing to look at. Low buildings with shuttered windows, a filling station, a scatter of trees, streets laid out in a grid a child could redraw as they pleased, moving a house here, a garage there, without ever needing a fresh box from the shop. It asked something different of a child than any wooden toy on the old shelves ever had. It asked them to keep building, to never quite finish, to treat the box not as a single gift unwrapped once and set on a shelf but as the opening move in something that might carry on for years. It needed one more piece to work properly though, and this was the part that had eluded everyone, Paige included back in England. The old studded brick could be stacked, but it could not truly hold. 2 bricks pressed together had nothing but friction and hope keeping them in place, and a tower built with any confidence toppled at the first careless hand. Gottfried wanted bricks that gripped one another the way 2 hands might grip firmly, and let go only when meant to. The answer, when it finally came together in the factory in Billund, was a matter of what sat underneath the brick as much as what sat on top of it. A ring of small hollow tubes on the underside, sized so precisely that the studs of the brick beneath were gripped firmly between those tubes and the brick's own inner walls, held not by glue, not by any moving part, simply by the closeness of the fit and the give of the plastic itself. It sounds a small thing, said plainly like that. It was not a small thing. It was the whole answer, arrived at only after a great many quiet, unglamorous months of testing one measurement against another in a back room. The the kind of steady work nobody thinks to write songs about. The patent for it was filed in Denmark on the 28th of January, 1958, timed almost to the moment. The story holds as though somebody in the office had waited for exactly the right instant to make it official. It would turn out to be one of the most quietly important pieces of paper the country ever produced, though nobody signing it that afternoon could have known how far its reach would run. Olkirk did not have long left to see where it led. He died in March of that same year, not many weeks after the patent had gone in, and the firm passed fully into Godfred's hands. The same Godfred who had once spent a whole night by lamplight, redoing a crate of ducks, now the one steering a company his father had built, twice over from the ashes of two separate fires. Godfred is not remembered as a man given to long public grief, and the firm, in the weeks after the funeral, kept working the way his father would have wanted it to. Orders filled, wages paid, the moulding machines running their patient, repetitive shifts in the same factory that had twice been rebuilt from nothing. But something had shifted regardless. The founder who had built all of this from a single joinery and rebuilt it twice from the ashes of two separate fires was gone. And everything that came after would be carried forward by sons who had only ever known the firm as something already reasonably sure of itself. There would be a third fire still to come, and this one would settle a question that had been sitting, unresolved, at the heart of the business for the better part of a decade. Whether wood or plastic was truly the firm's future, or whether it might, for a while yet, try to hold on to both. On the night between the 4th and 5th of February in 1960, fire found the warehouse where the wooden toys were kept in Billund. Nobody left to tell it could ever quite agree afterward on how it had started. And within that single night, very nearly the whole stock. The ducks, the yo-yos, the trucks with wheels that turned, 2 decades of good beach and careful varnish, burned to nothing. There was, this time, no talk of a fire brigade arriving too late through nobody's fault. There was, this time, a harder question waiting in the wreckage the next morning. One Olkirk himself was no longer there to answer. Godfred called his brothers together, and the family sat with the numbers and the ash and the plane. Fact that rebuilding a wooden toy works a third time would cost a very great deal, for a line of business that, brick by brick, the plastic side of the firm was already quietly outgrowing. They decided, in the end, not to rebuild it. The wooden toy line, the one that had begun this whole story back in a shop in Billund, in the depths of a hard winter, the one that had been rescued by its own quality twice already, would simply not be brought back a third time. From that point on, the firm would put everything it made behind its plastic building system instead, and the ducks, the trucks, and the yo-yos would not be made again. Not everyone in the family greeted the decision warmly. 2 of Godfred's brothers, who had never shared quite his conviction that a small plastic brick was worth betting an entire company's future on, would leave within the year to start a firm of their own, one that kept faith with wood and metal a while longer. It is a small, quiet sadness tucked inside a larger story of success, the kind of thing that rarely makes it into the anniversary retellings. A family finding that the very decision which saved the firm was also the decision that finally pulled some of them apart. But the choice held. The ducks were never brought back. The workshop that had once measured its worth in 3 careful coats of varnish on a beechwood bill would, from here on, measure it in something harder and smaller and interlocking. A system rather than a single toy, meant to be added to for as long as a childhood lasted and longer. Somewhere in a drawer in the Billund offices, unharmed by any of the fires, the plaque still hung. De beste ikke forgot. The words had outlived 2 workshops and were about to outlive a third material entirely. What they had never needed, it turned out, was wood to be true. You can leave the wooden toys there now, resting in the dark of that burned-out warehouse, and let them be still. There is another kind of quiet waiting just ahead. Not the quiet of ash this time, but the quiet of a single small thing, sitting alone on a workbench under a low lamp, waiting for someone to pick it up and turn it over in a hand, and consider, slowly, unhurriedly, everything a shape like that can hold. Picture a small block of steel, no bigger than a loaf of bread, sitting under a single hanging lamp in a tool room gone quiet for the night. Everyone else has gone home. The machines beyond the doorway have cooled and settled, ticking now and then as the metal in them shrinks back from the day's heat. But here, at this one bench, a toolmaker has left his glasses folded beside a half-finished mould, and the shape cut into its steel face is one of the simplest and most patient shapes ever drawn by human hands. A rectangle, studded on top with a shy grid of little raised circles, hollow underneath, waiting to be filled 10,000 times a day for the rest of a century. This is where the story slows all the way down. Away from fires, away from grief, away from the wooden ducks and the spinning tops and the long climb up from ruin. This chapter is about one small thing, the brick itself, not the company, not the family, not even the workshop. Just the small studded artifact, sitting in your palm, warm from the machine that made it, waiting for another to click against it. Let yourself settle a little further into the cushions now. There is nowhere else this chapter needs to take you tonight, except down into the very small, into the exact shape of a thing you may once have held 1,000 times without ever wondering how it came to hold so firmly. It was here in Billund in the late 1950s that Gottfried Kirk Christiansen, the founder's son, the one who had learned patience the hard way, standing over a burned building twice in his life, filed the patent that would change what this small thing could do. The old wooden bricks, and the first plastic ones after them, had held together only loosely. A stack of them could be knocked flat by a careless sleeve, or a sneeze, or a cat walking across a table. Children built with them the way you might build with playing cards, gently, holding your breath. Gottfried wanted something sturdier, something that would hold a tower up through an afternoon of play and still come apart, gently in small fingers, when it was time to put it away. The answer he found, filed as a patent on the 28th of January 1958, was startlingly simple once you saw it. Underneath the flat top of a brick, instead of leaving it hollow and empty, you fitted a ring of small tubes, and the studs on top of the brick below were gripped, snugly, between those tubes and the brick's own inner walls, held by a whisper of friction on every side. It is called the stud and tube system, and it does something almost too ordinary to notice. It holds, not too tightly, not too loosely. Just enough that a tower of them could be lifted by one corner brick, and the whole thing would come with it, swaying but whole. They gave that grip a name, later, clutch power, a modest phrase for something rather remarkable. Because here is the quiet truth of it, the fact that still makes the engineers at Billund sit back in their chairs a little. A brick pressed from that very first mould, back in 1958, will still click, cleanly, snugly, exactly as intended, into a brick made this week, on the far side of the world, from a mould that did not exist when that first one was cut. The studs have not changed, the tubes have not changed. Whatever else in the world had gone out of fashion, or been redesigned or quietly discontinued, the coupling between one brick and the next has stayed the same for the better part of a lifetime. Think of everything else from that same year that has not lasted so well. The wireless sets gone quiet in attics, the motor cars rusted down to nothing. Fashions, hairstyles, whole ways of speaking, all of it softened and faded and finally forgotten. And yet somewhere, in a drawer or a toy box, or the bottom of an old biscuit tin, a brick pressed under Gottfried's own supervision, in a factory lit by 1950s bulbs, is very likely still sitting patiently, ready this very evening to click onto a brick made only last month, as if no time had passed between them at all. There is something almost like faithfulness in that, a small stubborn kind of loyalty, built into steel and plastic that asks nothing of the years in between. Before it is a brick, it is nothing more than granules. Small, dry, colorless flecks of plastic, the size of grains of rice, poured by the ton into tall silos that stand like quiet grain towers along the edge of the factory floor. Each silo holds far more than any one machine could use in a day, so the plastic simply waits there, in the dark, patient as flour in a mill, until its moment comes. In the earliest years, those granules were cellulose acetate, a plastic that seemed at first like exactly what a toy company needed. Light, easy to color, easy to shape. But it had a fault that only showed itself slowly, over months, over years, the way some faults do. Left in a warm room, or a sunlit windowsill, or the back of a cupboard through a long summer, cellulose acetate bricks would begin, ever so slightly, to bend. Warp. A brick that no longer sat flat would no longer hold its neighbor properly, and a whole box of old bricks, taken down from an attic, might no longer click together the way they once had. Not broken exactly, just quietly, patiently, worn out of true. So in 1963, under the eye of a chemist named Hans Schiess, the factory tested the alternative thoroughly, and then changed its material for good. ABS, they called it, acrylonitrile butadiene styrene, a plastic with none of the old warping habit, more stable in heat, truer to its color over years of sunlight and handling. Cellulose acetate was retired that same year, its silos emptied and not refilled, until only the newer, steadier plastic remained. It is the plastic the factory still uses today, silo after silo of it, humming quietly through the dark hours of every night shift. Watch the granules now, pouring softly into the hopper's mouth, catching the gold light from the high windows as they fall. There is something almost like sand in the way they move, the way they settle, the small dry whisper of grain against grain. In a few moments they will be gone, drawn down into the machine below, and none of them will ever look like this again. Loose, formless, still capable of becoming almost anything at all, before the mold gives them their one final shape. Inside the machine, the granules are heated until they turn soft and pliant, somewhere near 230 degrees, and then driven, under a great deal of pressure, tens of tons of it, sometimes more than 100, into the waiting cavity of the mold. It happens in a matter of seconds. The plastic fills every corner of that small steel space, every stud, every tube, every rounded edge, before it is allowed to cool. And here is where the toolmaker's patience, back at that quiet bench under the lamp, becomes the whole of the story. The mold must be cut to a tolerance so fine that ordinary language struggles to hold it. 0.005 of a millimeter by the factory's own account. A gap in the steel no wider than a fraction of the width of a human hair. If the mold were looser than that, the studs would come out too small, and the clutch power, that quiet essential grip, would fail. If it were tighter, the bricks would jam or crack, or simply stay joined when they were meant to come apart. So the tool makers cut and check again, working by feel and by measurement together, until the steel is exactly right. And then it is locked into the machine, and it will stamp out the same shape, without complaint, a great many thousands of times before it is retired. Somewhere in that same building, a quieter kind of arithmetic goes on beside the presses. A running account kept season after season of exactly how many different shapes a set now needs. The earliest boxes held only a handful of forms: a brick, a plate, perhaps a window frame. Over the decades that followed, the family of shapes grew slowly outward. Wheels, hinges, tiny printed faces, curved roof tiles, gears no wider than a fingernail, until a single modern set might call on many hundreds of distinct parts, each one still governed by that same small tolerance, each one still, somehow, sitting quietly in the same family as the very first brick. The bricks come out warm. You could hold one, fresh from the press, and feel the last of that heat fading from it. The plastic still faintly soft at its very edges before the cool air of the factory floor finishes its work. They travel out along a conveyor belt in loose, tumbling rows, red and yellow, and that particular blue that has not changed its shade in decades, all mixed together, cooling, hardening, becoming themselves. There is a particular kind of sound to a factory floor like this one, late at night. Not silence, never quite silence, but a low, steady murmur of belts turning, and presses closing, and small plastic shapes tumbling gently against one another as they cool. It is the sort of sound that could carry a tired mind a long way towards sleep, if it were allowed to. A soft, repeating rhythm, the same shape made again and again and again, each one identical to the last down to the very thousandth of a millimeter. It is worth pausing here in the dim and the quiet to think about what such a small, ordinary thing is actually capable of. Take just 6 of the standard bricks, the common ones, 2 studs by 4, and ask how many different ways they might be stacked and fitted and offset against one another. For years, the company's own guess was a modest one, taken from an old estimate that had only ever considered towers built straight up, one brick directly above the last. But a Danish mathematician named Søren Eilers, turning the old number over in his mind, grew suspicious of it. He wrote a program to model every possible arrangement of 6 such bricks, not just towers, but wide, low, sprawling structures too, offset this way and that, studs meeting tubes at every imaginable angle. He let the program run for the better part of a week. When it finished, the number it gave him was almost too large to say aloud in one breath. 915,103,765. Not a guess, a count. And to be sure of it, he asked a young student working alone on a different machine, in a different piece of software, to try the same calculation without ever comparing notes. The student's program returned the very same number. 915,103,765 ways, from 6 small bricks, the kind a child might tip out of a box without a second thought, onto a rug, on any ordinary evening, anywhere in the world. But molds, like anything else, wear down in the end. Steel is patient, but it is not eternal. And after enough thousands of pressings, the tiny, exact edges that once held a tolerance of 5/1000ths of a millimeter begin, ever so slightly, to soften and round. A brick pressed from a tired mold might click less cleanly than it should. Rather than let such a brick reach a child's hands, the factory has always chosen to retire the mold entirely, no matter how costly it was to cut in the first place, no matter how many good years of service it has already given. And, so the story goes, in the early years those retired molds were not simply thrown aside, but carried out after dark and laid into the wet concrete of new factory foundations going up nearby. Buried there for good, under whichever building was rising at the time, so that no copy of that shape could ever be cut from them again. Somewhere beneath the floors of Billund, the tale suggests, whole quiet graveyards of old steel shapes are still resting under the weight of newer buildings, the studs and tubes of 1,000 retired molds pressed forever into concrete. They will never touch a brick from again. Later, when the buildings themselves stopped swallowing old steel, the worn molds were sent instead to a rolling mill some distance away, to be melted down under careful watch, the driver staying to see it done with his own eyes before he turned for home, making certain, right to the very last moment, that no rival hand could ever borrow that particular shape again. It is an odd kind of care to take over something so small, but that has always been the quiet, stubborn nature of this thing. A small, studded rectangle, warm from the press, holding, through fire, through changing plastics, through 915 million different arrangements of only 6 of them, onto exactly the same grip it was given, under a single hanging lamp, one night in Billund in 1958. Let your own hands rest now, quiet in your lap, as still as a tray of cooling bricks, and let the story drift gently from the small thing itself out to the wide, flat land that grew up around it. Now let the story lift its gaze from the small thing in your palm and out through the factory windows to the land it sits in. Picture Billund before any of this. Before the molds, before the plastic, before the airport and the theme park and the buses of visitors that would one day fill its car parks by the thousand. Picture instead a crossroads, a scatter of low farmhouses with turf and thatch, a dairy, a smithy, a small grocer's shop, a mission hall, a school with a single stove to warm it through the winter, and a joinery workshop with its lamps lit later than the rest, because a carpenter named Ole Kirk Christiansen was inside it, working. In the early 1930s, this whole place held perhaps 200 or 300 souls, no more, spread thin across flat, sandy, heather-covered ground that had never been especially generous to farmers. Peat was cut from the wetter hollows in those years and dried in low stacks along the field edges, the way it had been for generations before anyone thought of plastic at all. A branch railway had reached the village some years before, a single modest track carrying a handful of trains a day out toward the larger towns. But it changed the rhythm of the place only a little. Billund remained by any measure a quiet corner of the Jutland Heath, the sort of place a map might name in small print, if it named it at all. And yet it is worth sitting with that smallness for a moment, in the lamplight, before the story moves on, because everything that follows, the bricks, the millions of them, the theme park gates, the visitors arriving by aeroplane from countries whose names the old villagers would barely have recognized, all of it grew out of this one quiet crossroads, and none of it needed to. There were larger towns nearby, better connected, with proper stations and proper markets. Billund had none of that advantage. It had only a carpenter and his sons after him, and a stubbornness about quality that would not loosen no matter how small the workshop, or how far from anywhere it stood. Think for a moment of the sheer unlikeliness of it. A flat sandy parish with no great river, no harbour, no coal, no particular reason at all for the wider world ever to learn its name. And yet it is this same quiet place that would one day send small studded bricks to nearly every household on the earth. There is a lesson in that perhaps, though the story is in no hurry to spell it out tonight. For now, simply picture the crossroads. The low buildings, the smoke rising straight in windless winter air, the last lamp in the joinery burning long after every other window in the village has gone dark. Denmark itself, in those years just after the war, was slowly loosening its own belt. Rationing that had pinched households through the occupation, and the lean years after it was, by around 1950, being unwound piece by piece. Butter appearing more freely in shops, cloth no longer measured out by coupon, the small daily arithmetic of shortage beginning, at last, to ease. There would have been a particular kind of quiet relief in that, felt in kitchens up and down the country. A mother no longer needing to weigh out sugar in careful spoonfuls, a shopkeeper no longer needing to pull a coupon from a ration book before wrapping the week's bread. Out on the farms of Jutland, electricity crept further along the lines each year, reaching cottages that had managed for generations by lamp and hearth alone. One year, a farmhouse might still be lit by an oil lamp, swinging gently on its hook above the table, and only a season or two later, a bare bulb might be humming quietly overhead instead, casting a flatter, steadier light than any flame ever had. And into homes and workshops alike came a new kind of material that a great many people had barely handled before. Plastic. Bright, light, cheap to work, endlessly moldable. It must have seemed to a carpenter's eye trained on oak and beech, almost like a kind of magic. Wood that never needed felling, that came instead as granules from a sack, ready to become almost any shape a mold was patient enough to give it. It is worth remembering, too, that none of this arrived especially quickly, or especially evenly. Some farms had electric light years before their neighbours down the same lane. Some households clung to rationing habits, a jar kept half full out of old caution, a coupon book saved long after it had stopped being needed, for years after the shortages themselves had ended. Change, out here on the Heath, tended to arrive the way the tide arrives on a very flat beach. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you looked up and realized the whole shoreline had moved. As the factory grew through those years, so did the village around it. Families arrived from other parishes to take up work at the presses and the packing tables, and where there had once been fields there were, before long, rows of plain sturdy houses standing near the factory wall. Modest homes, put up quickly to house a workforce that seemed to grow every season. The story told in Billund is a simple one, repeated by those who remember it, that a man might arrive from elsewhere in Jutland with very little, and within a season or two find himself settled in a house near the factory, his children walking to a school that had, itself, grown larger to hold them. A whole small town rising, brick by brick you might say, though these particular bricks were laid the old-fashioned way, in mortar by hand. By the middle of the 1960s, the parish that had counted its residents in the low hundreds only a generation before had swollen into a small town of many thousands. Where the school had once made do with a single stove, there were now several buildings and several teachers, and playgrounds loud with the children of families who had come from every corner of Jutland to find work at the presses. The dairy grew larger, the grocer's shop became several shops, and through it all the factory kept expanding outward, hall after hall, silo after silo, so that from a distance the village might have looked to an old farmer returning after years away, like an entirely different place wearing the same name. By the start of the 1960s, Godfred Kirk Christensen had come to a plain, practical conclusion. A company that wished to sell its small studded bricks to the whole world needed a way for the world to reach it. Billund had a railway of sorts, and roads, but nothing swift, nothing that could carry buyers and salesmen and, before long, tourists in and out within a single working day. So in 1961 he laid a private airstrip on the Heath just north of the factory, a modest runway with a single hangar beside it, built at his own cost for his own aircraft, on land that had until recently grown nothing but heather and rough grazing grass. It grew, as things in this story tend to grow, faster than seemed reasonable. By 1964 the private strip had become a proper airport, built up through that year and opened on the 1st of November. With a paved runway almost exactly a mile long, and a small control tower watching over it. Twice a day a Scandinavian Airlines flight, now lifted off from that same stretch of Heath and set down again a little later beside the harbour and the spires of the capital, connecting a village of a few thousand souls directly to the wider world, in a matter of an hour or so, over land that had never before needed anything faster than a cart. Consider what a strange sight that must have made, to anyone old enough to remember the peat cuttings and the turf roofs of only a generation before. A silver aircraft lowering itself twice a day out of a grey Danish sky onto a heath where sheep had grazed within living memory. Farmers pausing at their fences to watch it pass overhead. Children running to the edge of the field nearest the strip to feel the ground shiver faintly under the weight of the landing. It must have felt to some of them as though the sky itself had quietly agreed to make room for Billund. Stand a moment on that runway, in your mind, in the low light of a Jutland evening. The Heath stretching flat and pale in every direction, a windsock hanging nearly still, the hangar's corrugated roof catching the last of the daylight. It is a strange kind of monument, an airstrip, No plaque, no statue, just two long stripes of tarmac laid across ground that had been, within living memory, entirely wild. Then, in the early summer of 1968, on the 7th of June, a new set of gates opened on the edge of the same small town. Gates to a park built almost entirely from the small studded bricks this chapter has spent its evening with, scaled up here and there into miniature towns, castles, harbours, whole landscapes rendered in the same bright, patient plastic. Gottfried had told a journalist beforehand that he hoped for perhaps 300,000 visitors across the season. A hopeful figure, some said a foolish one, for a park standing in the flat middle of Jutland, with no great city anywhere near it. By the time the gates shut for the winter at the end of October, 625,000 people had passed through them. Nearly twice what anyone, even the man who built it, had thought to expect. Picture the crowds that first season, arriving by car and coach along roads that had been quiet farm lanes only a decade or two before, walking beneath strings of lamps as the light faded, past miniature windmills and tiny painted harbours, none of them quite able to say, perhaps, why a village so small and so far from anywhere had managed to build something the whole country wanted to see. Buses queued along the edges of fields that had grown only rye and heather within living memory. Families picnicked on grass that a farmer somewhere might still have remembered ploughing. And inside the gates, small miniature versions of great cities stood scaled down to the size of a garden, built brick by hands that had, only a few years before, been fitting the same small studs into ordinary toy boxes on ordinary evenings. There is something gently moving, in hindsight, about a carpenter's grandchildren watching a crowd that size arrive at a gate on the edge of a village that had once held only a few hundred people entire. Whatever Ole Kirk had hoped for all those years before, standing over the ashes of a burned workshop, it is difficult to imagine he pictured quite this. Coaches of visitors, an airport built from nothing, a whole small nation's curiosity drawn out to a patch of heath that had never, in all its centuries, expected to be looked at by anyone at all. Let the evening settle now over the whole of it. The factory, the airstrip, the park gone quiet for the night, the houses strung out along streets that had been sand tracks within living memory. Snow is falling lightly over the heath beyond the last rooftops, the way it must have fallen here for centuries before anyone thought to build a village at this particular crossroads at all. Somewhere behind darkened factory windows, the presses have stopped for the night, and the last of the day's granules have cooled into their small, studded shapes, ready for tomorrow. Picture the whole shape of the place from above, as if you were drifting slowly over it in the dark. The long, low factory halls, warm light leaking faintly from a few windows, where a night shift still moves quietly between the machines. The straight, dark stripe of the runway beyond, empty now until morning. The pale, scattered shapes of the theme park's miniature rooftops, dusted with snow, waiting out the winter under cover. And around all of it, the heath itself, patient and flat and largely unchanged, stretching away into the dark in every direction, exactly as it had stretched away long before any carpenter ever set foot here at all. It is easy, looking at a place like this from a great distance of years, to think of it only as a company, molds and patents and visitor numbers. But underneath all of that still is simply a village on a heath, grown large around a workshop, filled with people who came from other parishes, with very little, and stayed. Somewhere in one of those darkened houses tonight, a family is likely asleep already, warm under heavy blankets, with no particular reason to think about airports or theme parks or tolerances of 0.005 of a millimeter. Only the ordinary, comfortable business of a Jutland winter night, the kind that has settled over this heath for longer than anyone now living can properly remember. Rest here a while in that quiet snow-softened dark, over the rooftops of Billund, before the story turns, in the next telling, from the town itself, to the people inside its factory walls, and the long, patient shifts they gave to it, hour after hour, year after year. There is a kind of quiet that only settles over a small town once it has agreed, without quite saying so, to organise its whole life around one building. Billund was like that. A scatter of farms on the Heath, sandy soil, a church, a school, a handful of roads that went nowhere in particular. And then, at its centre, the low wooden buildings of a man's carpentry shop, growing a little every year, the way a tree grows, without anyone in the town quite noticing, until the shadow of it fell across their doorways. You could think of it, if you like, as a house that kept adding rooms, and each new room needed hands. So the farms gave up their sons and daughters, one at a time, then in twos and threes, until whole families measured their days not by the light on the fields, but by the whistle at the workshop gate. It was not a hard thing to accept, not in a place where the winters were long and the soil was thin, and the carpenter paid in coin rather than in kind. A daughter who had spent her mornings feeding hens might spend her afternoons instead at a long bench under a window, a paintbrush in her hand, dipping and lifting and setting down, dipping and lifting and setting down, in a rhythm that asked less of the shoulders than milking did, and more perhaps of the eyes. Picture that paint room now, if you can, in the years just before the war and just after it, long tables under tall windows, the light coming in flat and even, the way it does in a room built for close work rather than warmth. Wooden ducks in rows waiting their turn. A trolley of little trucks with their wheels not yet fitted. The smell in that room was not of paint exactly. It was thinner than that, sharper, mixed with the sweetness of new-cut beech and the faint must of glue left to dry overnight. The women who worked there, and it was by all the old accounts of the town, largely women who did this particular work, as it tended to be in painting rooms of that kind across the province, moved without hurry and without waste, each duck given its full 3 coats in turn, dried in turn, because a firm that measured its worth in a plaque above a workbench did not look for its economies there. You should understand that this was never a factory in the way the word suggests to us now. Not at first. It was closer to a large family kitchen that happened to make toys instead of meals. The owner's own house stood beside the workshop, close enough that his children could be called in from play by leaning out of a window, close enough that the smell of sawdust reached the families washing on the line. His sons grew up underfoot in the place, learning the names of tools before they learned much else, and by the time the third of them, Gottfried, was a young man himself, the line between the family's home and the family's business had all but disappeared. It was Gottfried who would one day run the whole concern, but for years yet he was simply a boy who slept a few dozen paces from the machines that made the money that fed him. A boy for whom the sound of a lathe running late into the evening was as ordinary, as unremarkable as rain. Growth in a place like this did not feel like ambition from the inside. It felt like necessity, arriving again and again, each time a little larger than before. A new machine bought on credit because the old one could no longer keep pace with the orders. A new building raised because the old one had run out of floor. New workers taken on because the harvest that year had been thin and the farms nearby had more hands than the land could use. The town did not so much choose to become a company town as it was gradually absorbed into one. The way a path through a field becomes a road once enough carts have worn the same track. You could walk out from the workshop gate in almost any direction in those years and find a farmhouse that had, in some quiet way, become an extension of the business. A father who still kept a few pigs and a strip of barley might also carry a small wage home each Friday from the workshop, folded into an envelope, counted twice before it went into the tin on the mantel. His eldest boy might spend his mornings at school and his afternoons sweeping shavings from the workshop floor, glad simply to be near the machines, the way boys are glad to be near anything large and loud and slightly dangerous. It was not unusual in those years, for a whole extended family, parents, grown children, a cousin or two lodging nearby. To draw their entire living, one way or another, from the same low cluster of buildings, so that a bad month for the business was, without exaggeration, a bad month for the town entire. By the middle of the century, the wooden toys had given way, mostly to a different material entirely, and the sound of the place had changed with it. Where once there had been the whine of saws and the tap of small hammers, now there was a low, steady hum that never quite stopped at day or night. The sound of machines pressing melted plastic into steel molds, over and over, tirelessly, the way no team of carpenters ever could be. And with that change came a different kind of worker and a different kind of shift. Imagine now that you are the one walking into that hall at the start of a night shift. The cold outside still in your coat, your eyes adjusting from the dark of the yard to the low orange glow inside. The hall is long and the ceiling is high, and the machines stand in their rows like patient animals, each one fed by a hopper of granules the color of sugar, red or yellow or that particular blue that would become, in time, as recognizable as a flag. You take your place at your machine the way your father might once have taken his place at a plough. Not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of settled acceptance, because the work is steady and the wage is certain, and certainty in this part of the country, in those years, was worth a great deal. The heat from the machines is a small mercy against the cold coming through the walls. You watch the mold close and open and close again, and each time it opens, warm little bricks tumble down a chute into a bin below, still faintly soft, still carrying the last of their heat like bread just out of an oven. There is something almost hypnotic in it, the repetition, the tumble and the small clatter, hour after hour through the darkest part of the night, while outside the whole of Jutland sleeps, and the only lit windows for miles belong to this one low building on the edge of the heath. You learn to listen for the sound a machine makes when something is wrong before you can see what it is. A catch in the rhythm, a hesitation, the way a farmer learns to hear a cow that is not settling for the night. Not far from the moulding hall, in a smaller room with better light, sat the people whose task it was to notice what the rest of the line could not afford to. Quality in this business was never an abstract word. It was a hand closing around two bricks and pressing them together, feeling for the small, definite click that told you the fit was true, and then pulling them apart again, feeling for the resistance, the little reluctance in the plastic that meant a child could join two bricks together with confidence and pull them apart again without a fight. Too loose, and the whole tower a child built would slump sideways in an afternoon. Too tight, and small fingers would give up before they had properly begun. The inspectors worked with a patience that visitors to the plant, when there were visitors, found almost strange to watch. Bins of bricks would arrive from the moulding hall still warm, and a sample would be drawn out and tested again, by hand, because no machine yet built could feel a fit the way a person's fingers could. A brick that failed was not an occasion for drama. It went into a separate bin, to be melted down and given a second chance at being something else entirely. Nothing here was thrown away twice, not the plastic, and certainly not the workers, who tended, in that first generation, to stay a very long time. A woman who started on the paint benches as a girl of 17 might, by the time she was drawing her pension, have moved through half a dozen different rooms in the same low buildings, and have trained the daughters of the women she had started beside. There was a particular rhythm to the working day that the town organized itself around, without much discussion. The bakery opened its ovens to match the shift changes. The bicycle racks outside the gates filled and emptied twice within a day, a great slow tide of coats and headscarves and caps, moving in one direction at dawn and the other at dusk. In the canteen, the coffee was strong and cheap and drunk in enormous quantities, and the talk there was less often of the work itself than of children and weather and the price of things, because after enough years the work itself needed no discussion. It was simply the medium everyone moved through, the way water is to a fish. Winter tested this rhythm without ever quite breaking it. Snow came early to that part of Jutland, and often, and most years, it settled overnight across the loading bay, without any fuss, so that the first task of the earliest shift, before anything else, was to clear it. A man alone with a broad wooden shovel, working in the last of the dark, so that by the time the delivery lorries began backing in against the dock, the ground beneath them was bare and sure again. The lorries idled with their exhaust rising white into air, cold enough to sting, and the drivers stamped their feet and blew into cupped hands, while crate after crate of box bricks went up into the back, bound for shops in Copenhagen and Hamburg, and, before very long, for places a good deal further away than either. Nobody thought of any of this as remarkable at the time. It was simply what a Tuesday looked like in January, in a town that had quietly learned to keep working through weather that would once, not so many years before, have kept the whole of it indoors. And at the centre of all this still was the family whose name was on the gate. By the late 1950s, it was the founder's son Gottfried. His third son, though the one who had spent the most years closest to the business, who had taken the helm of the business in full. A young managing director still not yet 40, already known within the workshop for a certain restlessness of mind, a habit of pacing the floor of the moulding hall at odd hours, as though the machines might tell him something if he only watched them long enough. He had grown up, after all, in the room next door to this one, in the years when the whole operation could be walked from end to end in a single unhurried lap. Now he walked it in an hour, and still had not seen every face on the payroll. He kept even so an office with a window that looked directly down onto the yard where the delivery lorries loaded each morning, and it was said by those who worked closest to him that he preferred that view to almost any other in the building, that he liked to watch the crates go out, because a crate leaving the yard was proof, of a plain and countable kind, that the whole vast, humming, sleepless arrangement was still in fact working. It is worth sitting with this picture a while longer before the story moves on. The whole of a small Danish town, its farms thinned out, its young people gathered under one roof, learning a new rhythm together. The rhythm of a whistle, a shift, a wage. A whole life folded quietly into the life of a single family's ambition. And that family, in turn, folding its whole life into the town's. There was no great drama in most of it, only the slow accumulation of ordinary days. Mornings cycling in with the cold air stinging your face, evenings cycling home with it at your back instead, the moulding hall humming through every night in between, warm bricks falling steadily into their bins, and somewhere above it all a young man at a lit window, watching the yard and waiting, patiently, for morning. For a long while after the wood was given up entirely, the story of this place is mostly a story of rooms filling up. More buildings, more workers, more of that hum through the night, and, gradually, a shift in what the world outside expected of a little grey and red brick made in the middle of Jutland. The 1960s had brought the wheels and the roads and the first small figures a child could stand upright inside a scene. The 1970s, quieter in most respects, brought something smaller still and stranger, and in the long run more important than almost anything that had come before it. In a design studio not far from the moulding halls, a toy designer who had joined the company as a young man some years earlier spent long stretches of the decade sketching and carving and setting aside, one attempt after another, at a figure no larger than a fingertip. He tried perhaps 50 different versions before he found the shape that satisfied him. A body that could turn at the waist, arms that could lift and lower, hands fixed in a shape that could grip a tool or a cup, or nothing at all. There was a long debate, gentle and unhurried, about what colour such a figure ought to be, and the answer the team settled on was a plain, cheerful yellow, chosen precisely because it belonged to no particular people and every particular child at once. The design was patented from applications filed in the last years of the decade and launched to the world in 1978, though nobody in the room, by most accounts, fully understood what they had just made. It looked like a small thing. It would turn out to be the single most consequential piece of plastic the company ever produced, because a figure with a face and a posture gave a child something the brick alone never quite could. Somebody to send into the scene the bricks had built. The founder's grandson had taken the company's reins by this point, a young man himself, when he stepped into the role at the very end of the 1970s, and under him the growth of the following decade was the kind that looks, in hindsight, almost too easy. As though the company could not put a foot wrong. Themed sets multiplied, space and castle, and later, whole worlds licensed from elsewhere, joined the plain bricks on the shelves. Television advertising, then computer software, then theme parks bearing the company's own name spread the brand far past the toy aisle. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from 20 unbroken years of growth, and it is worth noticing, gently, in passing, that confidence of that kind rarely announces the moment it turns into something less useful. Into a belief that growth itself is the strategy, rather than the result of one. By the middle of the 1990s, the little grey and red bricks had become something closer to a fixture of childhood the world over than a mere toy brand, spoken of in the same breath as a small handful of names that needed no translation. Then, right at the decade's end, came a licensing arrangement with a well-loved film series that brought spaceships and helmets and small plastic heroes to shelves the company already knew well. And for a long stretch of years afterward, it seemed as though whatever the business touched turned, almost without effort, into another success. Visitors shown around the Billund plant in those years were taken past gleaming new production lines, robotic arms lifting finished boxes onto pallets bound for docks and airports on several continents at once, and standing in the middle of all that motion, it was easy enough to believe the growth would simply continue. The way fine weather is easy to believe will hold once it has held for long enough already. Through the first half of the 1990s, this confidence expressed itself as multiplication. The number of different toy lines grew faster than the number of children buying them. New categories were opened: clothing, watches, publishing, theme parks in more than one country. On the theory, never quite spoken aloud but clearly believed, that a beloved name could be extended indefinitely, the way a good story can. By the middle of the decade, the company was, by its own internal count, producing many thousands more distinct parts than it had a few years before. A great sprawling catalogue of specialized pieces, each designed for one particular set and rarely used again. It was, in its way, a kind of forgetting, a slow drift away from the plain, interlocking brick that had made the whole enterprise possible in the first place, and towards something that looked more like an unusually large toy department than a single coherent idea. The reckoning, when it came quietly at first. In 1998, the company posted its first loss in the whole of its history, a modest sum against the scale of the business, but symbolically enormous. The first crack in an unbroken run of profit stretching all the way back to the founding. A round of layoffs followed, the first the town had known of that size, and an outside manager was brought in for a time to tighten what had grown loose. It was treated at the time as a correction, a single bad year in an otherwise sound story. It was not yet understood as a warning. The warning arrived in full only a few years later, and by then it could no longer be mistaken for anything smaller than it was. Sales, which had held roughly steady through the turn of the century, fell away sharply in the early years of the new decade. Down by roughly a third in the space of little more than a single difficult year. And the debts taken on during the years of expansion, which had seemed manageable while the growth continued, suddenly did not seem manageable at all. By one internal reckoning, the company was losing money at a rate close to $1 million for every day that passed, and the total owed to its lenders had climbed toward $800 million, a sum that would have seemed to the young managing director pacing the moulding hall floor half a century earlier, entirely beyond imagining for a business built on children's playthings. Inside the company, in the summer before the worst of it became public, a young executive from the strategy office stood before the leadership and offered a description that people in the room would repeat for years afterward. That the business was standing, quite simply, on a burning platform, with more debt coming due than cash coming in, and no very obvious way off. In Billund itself, where by now 3 generations had grown up inside the rhythm of the plant, the uncertainty settled less as panic than as a kind of held breath. People who had never once doubted, across a whole working life, that the factory would still be standing in the morning found themselves doing sums at the kitchen table, quietly wondering what a town without its one great employer might actually look like. The shops depended on the wages the factory paid out. The school depended, in its own way, on families staying rather than drifting elsewhere to find work. Nobody spoke aloud of the whole thing closing. But for a year or two, it was no longer entirely unthinkable, and that alone was new. And it sat over the town the way weather sits. Always there, unignorable, and not to be argued with. What followed was not a dramatic rescue so much as a long, careful, unglamorous unwinding. Told slowly here because that is how it actually happened. Nothing about it was sudden. The family that had built the place and still owned almost all of it stepped back from daily control and put a considerable sum of its own private wealth behind the company to steady it through the worst of the debt. A quiet act that never made much of the outside coverage, but mattered enormously on the inside. In their place came a new chief, not a member of the family and not yet 40 years old, a former strategy consultant who had spent barely a few years with the company before being asked to run the whole of it. He inherited, in his first year in the role, a further steep drop in sales on top of the one before it, so that within a short time of taking charge, the business had lost a very large share of what it had been selling only 2 years earlier. It would have been easy, in that position, to panic, or to reach for some bold new venture to paper over the losses. He did, by most accounts, something quieter and harder. He asked the company to stop, and to look honestly at what had actually gone wrong. He was not, by training, a toy maker at all, and there was something almost useful in that distance. He could walk the same factory floor the founder's grandson had walked as a boy, and ask, without embarrassment, the plainest of questions. What exactly does this company make? What exactly is it for? The answers, once people were willing to sit with them, turned out to be simpler than anyone in the boom years had allowed themselves to remember. What had gone wrong, once looked at honestly, was mostly the catalogue itself. The business had, over the previous decade, allowed the number of distinct pieces it manufactured to swell into the many thousands. Each new mould an expense, each new part a small drag on a supply chain never designed to carry so much variety. The new leadership cut that number back hard, by roughly half, returning the design teams to a much smaller, much older set of shapes. The plain studs and plates and slopes that had always done the most work anyway. There was, among the designers who lived through it, a particular kind of relief in this. A return to the old discipline of making a great deal out of very little. The same discipline the founder's grandson had grown up inside, and the founder before him, back when a shape had to earn its place in the workshop or be set aside. Whole ventures that had drifted far from toys were sold away or closed. The theme parks that carried the company's name, expensive to run and only loosely tied to the profit of the core toy business, were sold in 2005 to another operator entirely. A deal that handed over control of the parks in exchange for a minority stake in the larger combined business that resulted, and brought in badly needed funds that let the business narrow its attention back to what it actually made. None of this happened in a season. It happened across several patient years, one line item at a time, one factory decision at a time. The debts falling a little further each year, the balance sheet healing the way a broken bone heals, slowly and without much to look at from the outside while it was happening. There is no need to hurry through it here, because nobody involved was hurrying either. The company simply kept its head down, kept building the same small set of shapes very well, let a licensed film property or two find an audience it had not expected, and let word travel slowly that the bricks were as good as they had ever been. Old sets long out of production were quietly reissued. Instructions that had grown fussy and overcomplicated across the boom years were pared back, so that a child opening a box on a quiet evening could finish the model without needing an adult's help at all. A small thing, but the kind of small thing the whole recovery turned out to depend on. Within a couple of years, the losses had turned to modest profit, and within a few more, the debts had been cleared entirely. By the middle of the 2010s, on the strength of a much simpler catalogue, a run of well-loved sets, and one particular film built entirely from its own bricks, the company's revenue passed that of its oldest and largest rival, and it stood for the first time in its history as the largest toy company in the world by sales. It is a strange thing to sit with, this second near death so much quieter than the fires that came before it. No flames this time, no neighbours passing buckets in the dark, nothing so vivid as a burning workshop against a night sky. Only a slow accumulation of good decisions, made without fanfare, by people who understood, in the end, that the whole enterprise had only ever really needed to do one thing well: to make a small plastic brick that would join cleanly to another small plastic brick, made anywhere, at any time, by anyone. Everything else, the parks, the ventures, the vast unwieldy catalogue, had been, it turned out, extra, worth having when the core was strong, dispensable in the end when it was not. The family never left entirely, even at the depth of it. They had stepped back from running the business day to day, but their name stayed on the door. Their private holding company kept 3/4 of the ownership for itself, with the remaining quarter settled into a foundation carrying the family's own name, and the founder's grandson, older now and no longer at the helm himself, kept a quiet hand on the whole affair from the side, the way a parent stands near without hovering, while a grown child learns to ride out a difficult season alone. It mattered to the town, this staying. Billund had watched one family's ambition become the whole of its own life 2 generations before, and it would not have known quite what to become if that family had simply walked away when the numbers turned bad. The company breathes easily again now, has done for a long while, its warehouses and offices settled into the same steady hum that has run beneath this whole story since the wood gave way to plastic. The moulding halls still run through the night. The loading bay still clears its snow before the first lorry of the morning. And somewhere in those buildings, below the noise of the machines and far from the light of any office window, there is a room that keeps almost everything the company has ever sold. One example of nearly every set it has ever put its name to, going all the way back to the first painted duck. It is kept dim and cool and very quiet, the way such rooms tend to be kept, and it is there, in that stillness, that the story continues next. Underneath the house in Billund, underneath the ordinary rooms with their ordinary furniture, there is a room that does not behave like other rooms. It is a basement. It is nothing more than a basement. Concrete underfoot, a low ceiling, air kept carefully dry and carefully cool, because paper and old cardboard do not care for damp, and neither does old varnish, and neither does old paint. A single bulb burns in the corridor, and it is enough. It has always been enough. Nothing in this room asks for more light than it already has. You could walk its whole length in a short, unhurried stroll, and yet it holds, inside that short walk, the better part of a whole century. No windows, no draught, no sound but your own footsteps on the concrete, and even those seem to arrive muffled, as though the room itself were asking, gently, that you keep your voice down and your steps light, out of consideration for whatever is resting on the shelves around you. Down here, on shelf after shelf after shelf, sit boxes. Not new boxes, not boxes waiting to be sold. Boxes that have already been sold once, long ago, and were sent back gently and asked to stay. There is a box from the earliest years when the toys inside it were made of wood, and the wood still smells faintly of pine, of glue, of a workshop that no longer exists except in this smell. There is a box from a decade later when the wood had given way to a new material nobody quite trusted yet. There is a box from a decade after that, and one after that, and one after that, each a little different from its neighbour, none of them raising its voice above the others. They call this room Memory Lane, those who are allowed to walk it, and it is a fair enough name because that is what a lane is. Not a hall, not a stage. A quiet path with things standing along either side of it, waiting to be noticed, in no hurry to be noticed at all. If you were to walk the lane slowly and let your hand trail along the shelf edge without lifting anything down, you would pass a box holding a small wooden duck on wheels, its paint gone soft and pale with age, and not far from it a box holding a plain brick, red as a coal at the heart of a fire, its studs still catching the low light the same way they caught it the day the box was first sealed. Further along, a box for a whole toy town, its little houses folded flat and waiting. Further still, a box for a castle, then a station, then a ship, each one a small idea from a particular year, kept in the company of every other small idea from every other year. None of them louder than the rest, none of them asking to be looked at first. Somewhere in the company's own account books, not the ones about money, the other ones, the ones that simply keep a note. There is a line for every piece the factory has ever made, every shape, every shade, every small design that came and went and was never quite repeated. A ledger, if you can call it that without the word feeling too grand, of a great many small decisions, each one written down, each one kept, so that nothing that was ever made is ever entirely lost, even after it has stopped being made. New boxes arrive here all through the year, in truth, not once but many times over. Every time the factory finishes a new set, a single example is carried down the same stairs and set on the same kind of shelf, in the same unhurried way as the one before it. Nobody rushes to do it. Nobody marks the moment with any ceremony. The lane simply grows quietly all year round, the way a shoreline grows by exactly as much sand as the tide leaves behind, without ever needing to be told to slow down or speed up. Think of that for a moment, and let the thought settle rather than sharpen. Somewhere, right now, in a cool dry room with one bulb burning, a box from long ago is sitting exactly where it sat yesterday, and the day before, and will sit tomorrow. It is not doing anything. It does not need to. It has already done what it was made to do, and now it simply rests the way a good tool rests on a hook when the day's work is finished, in no discomfort, in no rush, in the dark. And somewhere near it, a much newer box rests in exactly the same way, as though it had always been there too, as though a year or 80 years made very little difference at all to a thing that only ever has to sit quietly and be kept. For a long while, this company had another way of letting things rest. When a mold wore down, and every mold wears down, eventually, however carefully it is made, however carefully it is used, the metal softening at its edges after enough millions of pressings, it was never simply thrown away. That was the old rule, and it held for the better part of half a century. A worn mold was not sold. It was not given to a rival. It could not be allowed to keep making its shape, however slightly wrong that shape had become, because a piece that no longer fit its neighbour perfectly was not a piece this company was prepared to put its name to. So the old mould went, instead, into the foundations, into the concrete poured for the next building, and the one after that, laid down and covered over, and built upon, so that it could never again press a single shape into the world. Picture it, if you can, without hurrying the picture. Late in the working day, when the light outside has gone the colour of weak tea, a man carries a mould that has given years of good service. Years of the same shape over and over, growing very slightly softer at its edges with every pressing, until one day it no longer meets the standard it once met so easily. He does not mend it. He does not sharpen it and send it on its way to a smaller job somewhere less exacting. He sets it down in a wide wet bed of new concrete and watches it settle and walks away. And by morning the concrete has gone hard around it, and a new floor stands where the mole used to be, and nobody walking across that floor in the years afterward will ever know, or need to know, what is resting quietly beneath their feet. Decades later, long after everyone who had done the burying had gone home for the last time. A building came down to make way for a newer one, and the workers found them. A great many old molds, resting exactly where they had been left, dating back further than most of the people standing over them had been alive. Some had lain there since the years just after the war. Some were newer, from a decade or two on from that. Nobody had forgotten they were there. Nobody had needed to remember either. The ground had simply kept them, the way the basement keeps its boxes, without complaint, without comment, for as long as it took. Patient in the particular way that only concrete and old iron know how to be patient, which is to say, entirely and without effort. There is something almost restful in that thought, if you let it sit rather than examine it too closely. A worn thing doesn't have to be fought with, or corrected, or apologized for. It can simply be laid down gently, and covered, and left, and the building goes on standing above it, none the worse for what is buried beneath. And yet the making itself never stopped, not even for a single night. A little way outside the old part of the village stands the factory they built at Cornmarken, larger than anything that came before it, a building the size of a small town in itself, divided into hall after hall, each one holding line upon line of the same patient machines, and inside it, long after the office lights have gone dark for the night, a small night shift moves quietly between the presses, keeping the whole vast humming arrangement company until morning. The lines keep working, line upon line of them, each one shut around its own small mold, each one opening and pressing, and closing again hour after hour, through the whole of the night, tended lightly by the few hands still moving among them. The air in the hall stays warm, faintly sweet with the smell of warm plastic, the way a kitchen stays warm long after the oven has been switched off. Much of the work by now runs itself, needing only a watchful few to mind it, rather than a great many hands. In the tall automated store beside the moulding hall, taller than most houses in the village, though you would never guess it from outside, narrow machines glide down the aisles in the dark, lifting a box from one shelf, setting down an empty one in its place, answering to nothing louder than a signal passed quietly from one steady system to another, needing barely a hand laid on them from one night to the next. Only the low, even hum of something built to keep its own time, all through the hours when the rest of the village is asleep, the store filling and emptying and filling again, like a slow, patient set of lungs. If you have ever lain awake, very late, and heard some far-off steady sound through a wall, a boiler perhaps, or a fan, or a pipe settling, and found it oddly soothing rather than troubling, because it meant something was quietly doing its work without needing you to mind it, then you already know the sound of that factory in the deep hours of the night. Patient, even, uninterested in hurrying towards morning, simply carrying on the way water carries on finding its way downhill, because that is what it is built to do, and it does not need applause for doing it. Outside, the village around the factory sleeps on, quite unaware of exactly how many small shapes are coming into being while it does. It does not need to be aware. That perhaps is the whole point of a good night's work being done well. The world it is done for gets to go on sleeping through it, undisturbed, and wakes to find the day's small needs already quietly met. There is a kind of comfort particular to places that keep going quietly, night after night, minded by only a handful of hands. A lighthouse, turning through the dark whether or not a ship happens to be passing. a clock in an empty hallway, still keeping its time. This factory, at its quietest hour, belongs to that same small family of things, not dramatic, not urgent, simply continuing, tended lightly rather than left entirely alone, because continuing is what it was built for, and it has never once needed to be told to stop and rest. It rests by working steadily, the way some people do, the way perhaps you do, on the better nights. And under it all, quite literally under it, under the concrete, under the newer buildings, under the ordinary streets of an ordinary village. The old worn shapes lie exactly where they were laid, keeping nobody's secret, causing nobody any trouble, simply finished with their work, and glad, if a buried thing can be glad of anything, to have been allowed to stop. Nothing here is thrown away, in the end. It is only ever set down. The box goes into the basement, the mould goes into the foundation. The night's work goes into the quiet running of a machine minded by hands that ask for very little. And somewhere above all of it, a village goes on sleeping, without once wondering whether anything down below is still moving. It is. Softly, steadily. It always has been. There is no rush anywhere in this chapter of the story, and there never was meant to be. A basement does not hurry to fill itself. A machine does not hurry through its night shift simply because morning is coming. A worn mould laid gently into wet concrete does not hurry to harden. It simply waits, patient as stone, for the setting to happen in its own good time. If you have found your own thoughts slowing, somewhere in the telling of all this, that is no accident either. This is a chapter built the way the room it describes was built. Low lit, unhurried, glad to let its stillness do the work that noise and haste could never quite manage on their own. Come out of the factory now and walk a little, the way you might walk a familiar street on a warm and windless night, in no hurry to reach anywhere in particular. Your feet find the pavement without needing to look for it. There's a smell of cut grass somewhere, and cool air, and the particular hush that settles over a small place once its shops have shut their doors, and its windows have gone dark one by one, until only a scattered few are left glowing, soft and yellow, behind curtains drawn for the night. Somewhere a gate closes on quiet hinges. Somewhere further off a dog settles itself down with a long, contented sigh. The whole village breathes slowly, the way a sleeping animal breathes, each street rising and falling gently under the weight of an ordinary, uneventful night. The village around you is small. It has always been small. A few thousand people, no more, living where a carpenter once kept a workshop on the edge of open heathland, in a corner of Jutland so unremarkable that, for a long while, nobody thought to put its name on a map at all. And yet everything here was built, in one way or another, by the same family over the same century, out of the same patient habit of making one small thing well, and then making it again. A shop became a workshop became a factory became a village large enough to need its own school, its own shops, its own quiet streets for you to walk down now, long after everyone in them has gone to bed. Walk far enough, past the last of the houses, and the streets simply stop, and the land opens out. And there, flat, wide, quiet under a sky with more room in it than a city sky ever has, lies a runway. It was not always here. A son of the carpenter built it first as little more than a strip of grass in a shed, so that a small airplane might land near the factory rather than a long way from it, and save an afternoon's driving on a bad road. It began, in other words, out of the same small practical wish that had already built so much of this village. Not a grand ambition, just a wish to make a slow, awkward thing a little easier, a little quicker, a little less trouble than it had been the year before. In time, the grass became tarmac, and the shed became a proper building, and the twice daily flight to the capital became dozens of flights to dozens of places, until this small village found itself with the busiest airport in the whole country, apart from the capital zone. It is a strange thing to hold in your mind, walking here in the dark. A town of only a few thousand people, and a runway wide enough and busy enough by day to rival the airports of far larger places. And yet the strangeness fades quickly enough once you remember how this whole village came to be. One small useful thing, followed by another, until the sum of them looked like something nobody could have quite planned from the beginning. At this hour it is still. A single light burns at the far end of the runway, the way a single candle burns in an otherwise dark room, marking the place rather than lighting it. No aircraft moves. The whole wide field simply waits, the way a good field waits for morning, without minding how long the waiting takes. Somewhere at the edge of the tarmac, the grass keeps growing quietly in the dark, the way grass always has here, since long before there was a runway laid across it at all. Turn back towards the village now, and the walk takes you past a house you have already heard something of, though perhaps not by name. After the first fire, the one that took the workshop and the family's own home together in one long night, neither of the sons who caused it ever quite forgot. The carpenter had this house built new, in the good plain style the country favoured at the time. A steep roof, a well-set door, windows in careful proportion to one another. He asked an architect to draw the plans properly, this time, rather than build by instinct alone, as though the fire had taught him that even a careful man benefits from a second pair of eyes. And at the entrance, standing guard over nothing in particular except the quiet fact of the house itself, 2 carved stone lions. It is for them that people came to call it the Lion House, and the name outlasted every other name the building might have had. A stone path runs up to the door, poured smooth and solid, the only paved path in the whole village when it was first laid. A small vanity perhaps, on the carpenter's part, or perhaps simply a man showing, in the one material he trusted most after wood, that this time the building would hold. You can almost picture him standing back from it once the concrete had set, testing it with the toe of one boot, satisfied in the plain, unshowy way of a man who has just made something solid with his own hands and does not need anyone else to tell him so. It is dark now and shut up for the night, and the 2 lions keep their old watch in silence, the way stone always does, asking nothing of the street around them, offering nothing louder than their own steady shape against the sky. A house that burned once, rebuilt to stand, and it has stood quietly ever since through every later fire that came for the workshop, but never again for the house itself. On the main street between one ordinary shopfront and another stands a plain white building with no sign to explain itself, and no queue outside its door, because there is nothing here for a visitor to queue for. This is the older idea house, the one that came before the newer, grander building you are walking towards now. The place where the family's own home once stood beside the very first workshop, gathered together over the years into a quiet private account of everything the company has ever been. It is not open to the public. It was never much advertised, even when parts of it once were. These days it belongs mostly to the people who work here, who might wander through it on a quiet afternoon, the way you might leaf through an old photograph album kept in a drawer at home, not for anyone else's benefit, only for the plain, private pleasure of remembering. Tonight its windows are dark, like every other window on this street, and it keeps its long, private memory to itself, the way a good keeper of memories generally does. Further on, past streets that grow no busier however far you walk them, stands a much newer building, new, at least, by the standards of everything else in this story. It went up in 2017, not so very long ago as this story measures things. A shape unlike anything else in the village. A whole cluster of tall stacked forms, each one set slightly off from the one below it, so that from a distance the whole building looks, if you let your eyes soften, very much like something a careful hand once built, out of a much smaller version of the very same shape. By daylight, there are roof terraces set between the blocks, each one a small garden of play built high above the street, and children climb from one to another the way you might, once have climbed between the cushions of a sofa, believing, for the length of an afternoon, that the floor itself had become something to be avoided. They call the building the home of the brick, and it is not a hard name to understand once you have seen the place. Inside by daylight, a great tree rises through the open middle of the building, taller than a house itself, built entirely from the same small interlocking pieces that started all of this, in a workshop, on a wooden bench, the better part of a century ago. Millions of them, fitted together one at a time by hands no less careful than the hands that once carved a wooden duck and set it on 4 small wheels. At night the tree is dark, the atrium is dark, the whole vast quiet shape of the building stands closed against the sky, waiting, and the way every good thing in this story seems, eventually, to wait. It asks nothing of the street. It simply stands, block upon block, holding its great dark tree inside it until the doors open again and the light finds its way back in. A little further still, and the streets give way to something stranger. A whole miniature world laid out under the open sky, canals and harbours, and tiny lit windows no larger than a hand. Streets scaled down until a grown man might step over a house in a single stride. By day this place is full of noise and colour and children running between the small buildings, as though they themselves had grown small enough to fit. Tiny boats sit moored along tiny quaysides. Tiny trains stopped mid-journey for the night, wait at tiny platforms for a morning that has not yet come. A whole harbour town, built brick by brick over years of patient work, stands utterly still, holding its breath the way only a place built for daytime can hold its breath once the day has gone. At night it is only shapes, a miniature town sleeping inside a real one, which is itself sleeping inside the wider dark of the whole country, which is itself only a small part of a much larger world. Moonlight catches the still water of the little canals and turns it the colour of pewter. Nothing in the whole small world moves, and it is worth remembering, walking here in the dark, that the very small thing in your own house, wherever it is packed away tonight, the single brick left in a drawer or a shoebox or the bottom of an old tin, is one among more bricks than there are people alive to hold them. Dozens for every person on earth, spread across every country that has a child in it, and yet each one small enough to close a hand around, and quiet enough, sitting still in the dark, to trouble nobody's sleep at all. The family that began all of this in a carpenter's workshop still holds it all these years later. Still the same name, carried down through son after son, until it reached, not long ago, a great-grandson of the carpenter himself. A young man who took up the chairman's chair the way each generation before him had taken it up. Quietly, without ceremony, simply because it was, once again, his turn. No great argument was needed. No outside voice was invited into the decision. One generation set the chair down, gently, and the next generation sat in it, the way a child settles into a seat still warm from someone else who sat there only a moment before. The company he oversees now reaches almost everywhere in the world, its machines humming now in 6 countries besides this one. The village that made it reaches barely beyond its own edges. A few thousand people, its original factory town still. One family still, after 4 generations, choosing to keep what was theirs rather than sell it on to someone who never knew the carpenter, never smelled the pine shavings, never once had to rebuild a workshop by lamplight after a fire had taken the last one. It would have been simple enough, at any point along the way, to let it go to someone else, somewhere else, and perhaps grow it faster, louder, further. Nobody in this family, across 4 generations now, appears to have wanted that particular kind of faster. That is the whole of it, really, if you stand back far enough to see it plainly. A small village, a family that stayed, a room in a basement that keeps every box it was ever given. A factory that keeps working quietly through the night, tended by hands that never make much noise about it, a runway built to save an afternoon's driving, grown into the second busiest gate into an entire country. None of it loud, none of it in a hurry. All of it simply continuing, the way a good fire continues, long after the room around it has gone quiet. It would be easy enough to tell this as a story about growth, about a small workshop becoming a great company, a private airstrip becoming a national gateway, a family becoming, by any ordinary measure, a very wealthy one indeed. All of that is true enough in its way. But walking here at this hour, with the streets empty and the shop fronts dark and nothing moving but your own quiet footsteps, it feels like a smaller and steadier story than that. A story about staying somewhere, about choosing, again and again, across 4 long generations, not to leave. About a family who could have taken their name and their fortune anywhere in the world they pleased, and chose instead to keep both of them here, in a village of a few thousand people, on the edge of a heath where a carpenter once mended furniture for his neighbours because there was, in those early years, very little else to be done. Walk back now, if you like, the way you came. The streets will still be empty, the lamps will still be low, and somewhere behind you, a small light will still be burning, in a workshop, in a basement, in a factory that never quite goes dark, waiting, patiently, the way it always has for morning. We end where we began, in a small workshop on the edge of a village whose name once nobody thought to write down. A single lamp burning low, a bench worn smooth by a carpenter's hands, and on that bench, side by side, 2 small things, a wooden duck, its paint a little faded now, and a single red brick, its studs catching the lamplight the way they have always caught it, in every year since a young mould maker first pressed one out and held it up to see whether the shape had come out true. The house burned 3 times, you know that now. Once when 2 boys, half by accident, set the wood shavings alight and took the workshop and the family's home together in a single night. Once in the deep cold of a war, when the whole factory went up and there was for a while nothing left to make anything with at all. And once more, years later, when the very warehouse built to hold the firm's old wooden toys caught fire and burned through a long night while the whole village stood in the road and watched. 3 times the flame took what had been built. Twice someone walked back into the ash once it had cooled, and began again, the same way as before, only sturdier. The 3rd time they did something braver than simply beginning again. They looked honestly at what the fire had actually spared, and let the rest go. Not because letting go was easy, because it was, in the end, the truer thing to do, and a carpenter's hands, sooner or later, learn to tell the difference between what is worth rebuilding and what is not. Out of that came a duck on wheels, and then a brick that clicked into its neighbour and held. Out of that came a workshop that became a village that built its own airport, a family that has kept its promise through 4 generations without once needing to raise its voice about it. Out of 3 fires came, of all things, a habit of patience. The patience of a shelf in a basement, the patience of a machine working quietly through the night, the patience of a village that never grew louder than it needed to. So there is no need tonight to hold on to anything too tightly, not the plan still waiting for tomorrow, not the small worries that came loose somewhere during the day and have been circling ever since. Let them rest the way the old molds rest, under the concrete, under the ordinary streets, doing no harm to anyone, needed by no one, simply finished, simply still. The duck and the brick sit quietly on the bench, exactly as they have sat through this whole long telling. Small things, plain things. Enough, it turns out, to have built a great deal on if you have the patience for it, and the willingness to begin again after everything is lost, and lost again, and still, somehow gently, is not. So there is no need to hold on to anything tonight. The flame settles, the dark is warm, sleep well,